Donald Trump's allies want Americans focused anywhere except the economic and political consequences now surrounding his administration. But even the source material attacking that media strategy contains claims that are asserted far more confidently than they are actually established. That matters because this story is supposed to be about distraction, credibility, and manipulation. And if we are going to test those things seriously, we have to apply the same standard to everyone. Fox News, the White House, Trump's critics, and the people telling us what all of it supposedly means. Start with the clearest documented contradiction in the material. Fox aired a graphic saying the average gasoline price a year earlier was $4.13 a gallon. The network later corrected that number on air, saying the actual figure was $3.13. In the correction quoted in the source, the correspondent said current prices were 90 cents higher than a year earlier and added that the Trump administration expected prices to fall once operations in Iran ended. That is not a minor typo in a story about household costs. Changing the comparison point by a full dollar can radically change the impression viewers get about whether prices have risen or fallen. And this is where the political stakes become real. Gasoline is not an abstract Washington statistic. It is the number people see on a sign while driving to work. Diesel flows through trucking, agriculture, construction, and shipping. When a network presents the wrong historical comparison during a politically sensitive price surge, viewers may walk away with a false picture of who is paying more and how much. The correction matters, but so does the original error, especially when the administration's economic performance is itself part of the political argument. Here is the first standard worth applying. If a network you distrusted made a $1 error that happened to make your preferred president look better, would an on-air correction the next day fully settle the credibility problem? The answer does not have to be no. Corrections are an essential part of responsible journalism. But the direction, magnitude, prominence, and repetition of an error all matter when we judge whether viewers were meaningfully misled. The source then makes a much broader accusation that Fox is functioning as state regime media, deliberately distracting viewers from Trump's problems by filling airtime with lightweight or inflammatory cultural stories. The examples are specific. One segment questioned college students in bikinis about civics and politics. Another discussed Representative Nancy Macy's tattoos while showing bikini photographs. Other programming mocked New York political figures over bike helmets, attacked socialist influencers, and defended data centers against criticism. Those examples can support an argument about editorial priorities. They do not by themselves prove centralized coordination with the White House or a deliberate conspiracy to conceal bad news. That distinction is important. A network can choose shallow, partisan, sensational, or audience-pleasing programming without being literally controlled by the state. It can also give disproportionate attention to stories that reinforce the preferences of its audience. Those are testable editorial criticisms. Calling it regime media is an interpretation. The evidence presented here shows a contrast between serious events and the programming highlighted by the source. It does not establish who ordered those segments, why each producer chose them, or whether they displace specific reporting that otherwise would have aired. Now look at the contrast itself, because that is where the strongest case sits. According to the material, the same programming environment discussing tattoos, bikinis, bike helmets, and internet personalities was also covering rising fuel prices, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and American operations involving Iran. One Fox correspondent reportedly acknowledged that the reserve was at its lowest level in decades and used a Hall and Oates reference to describe how far back you had to go to find a comparable level. The source treats that joke as evidence of trivialization. Maybe it was, but the underlying fact was still being reported to Fox viewers. That complicates the distraction thesis. If the network were trying to hide the reserve issue completely, mentioning it on air would be a strange way to do that. A more defensible conclusion is narrower. Serious information can be surrounded by framing, humor, culture war material, and partisan interpretation that changes how audiences emotionally process it. The important question is not simply whether a fact appeared somewhere on television. It is whether the fact was presented accurately, proportionately, and with enough context for viewers to understand its significance. The source also says Trump's administration is involved in a catastrophic and unlawful war in Iran, and it repeatedly presents the conflict as a direct cause of surging fuel prices. But the material provided here does not include the legal authorization, operational orders, congressional record, court ruling, or independent price data needed to establish every part of that claim. It does quote Fox describing operations in Iran and an administration position that gasoline prices would fall when those operations ended. That supports the existence of a connection being publicly drawn between the conflict and energy prices. It does not, on its own, prove the full legal characterization used by Trump's critics. This is exactly the kind of moment where political certainty can outrun the evidence in front of us. A claim can fit your broader view of a politician and still need verification on its own terms. Strong convictions deserve evidence strong enough to survive a hostile fact check. Don't Get Played gives you a practical method for doing that before you risk your credibility. The complete digital ebook is only $9 one time. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment, because the next accusation in this story requires that same discipline. That accusation concerns Senator John Ossoff and Natalie Harp. The source says Ossoff criticized Trump for spending time with Harp, conducting thousands of stock trades and focusing on a golden ballroom rather than helping Americans. It then argues that Fox personalities treated merely invoking Harp as distasteful, while tolerating much harsher behavior from Trump. The quoted Fox discussion is more nuanced than the source's characterization. One speaker criticized the Harp reference as beneath Ossoff, but also praised him as a prolific and bipartisan legislator who had worked with Republicans on opioids, prisons, veterans affairs, and infrastructure. That matters because selective clipping can flatten an argument. The Fox segment, at least as reproduced here, was not simply Ossoff bad. It contained criticism and praise. The criticism focused on whether mentioning Harp was relevant or merely designed to generate a viral clip. The source's response is that Trump himself routinely uses personal insults, so treating Ossoff's remark as uniquely indecent reflects a double standard. That is a legitimate consistency test, but to evaluate it fairly, we would need the full Ossoff remark, the context of Harp's role, and the exact standards Fox applies when Trump makes comparable personal attacks. The broader point survives even without pretending we have every missing piece. Political media often applies standards asymmetrically. Conduct becomes disqualifying when the other side does it and understandable when an ally does it. That tendency is not exclusive to one network or one party. The useful test is brutally simple. Would the same commentators describe the same tactic the same way if the names and parties were reversed? If the answer changes with the jersey, then the standard is not really a standard. There is another layer here. The source makes extremely serious claims about Trump, including allegations involving sexual assault liability, the Epstein files, personal enrichment, tax treatment, stock trading, and an alleged episode in which Trump hid in a catering container with Harp because he feared an Iranian assassination attempt. Some of those statements may refer to real legal records or public reporting, but the material supplied for this script does not provide the underlying judgments, filings, financial disclosures, intelligence assessments, or independent reporting needed to verify the full chain, so they cannot responsibly be bundled together as established facts merely because they appear in an emphatic monologue. That is not a defense of Trump, it is a defense of evidentiary standards. If a civil judgment exists, cite what it actually found. If an appeal was denied, identify the court and what the denial legally means. If there were 21,000 trades, establish whose trades they were, over what period, under what disclosure regime, and whether Trump personally executed or benefited from them. If a government settlement eliminated tax liability, show the settlement. If intelligence agencies disputed an assassination warning, show the reporting or assessment. The more explosive the accusation, the more important the sourcing becomes. And that creates an uncomfortable reflection for critics of Trump. If the central complaint is that pro-Trump media manipulates audiences with selective facts and emotionally loaded framing, what happens when anti-Trump media uses claims that are not fully demonstrated in the material it presents? The political conclusion may ultimately be correct, But a weakly sourced shortcut gives opponents an easy way to dismiss stronger evidence sitting right beside it. Notice what has happened as we move through the material. The most persuasive evidence is not the insult heavy language calling people losers, manipulators, sociopaths, or sickos. Those labels add heat but prove nothing. The strongest evidence is the concrete correction of the gasoline graphic, the juxtaposition of serious economic reporting with culture war entertainment, and the visible inconsistency in how political conduct can be framed depending on who commits it. Those are things a viewer can actually examine. And the strongest reasonable defense of Fox is also straightforward. Cable networks cover many subjects. A silly segment does not prove serious stories are being suppressed. A corrected graphic can demonstrate that an error was caught rather than that a lie was ordered. Commentary programs are not the same thing as straight news broadcasts, and audiences may genuinely want cultural stories alongside war and economics. All of that is fair. The question is whether those defenses explain the pattern or merely excuse it. What evidence would change your judgment here? If internal messages showed producers intentionally replacing damaging economic coverage with distractions, the regime media accusation would become much stronger. If instead, full programming logs showed extensive critical reporting on fuel prices, Iran, the reserve, and Trump's political problems, the claim of systematic concealment would weaken. That is what a falsifiable political argument looks like. You should be able to say what evidence could prove you wrong. This is where viewers are most vulnerable to political packaging. A correction feels like proof of bad faith. A dramatic chart feels like proof of collapse. A viral clip feels like proof of hypocrisy. Sometimes those impressions are justified, sometimes they are not. The discipline is to separate what the evidence directly establishes from what the narrator wants you to infer. That distinction is not emotionally satisfying, but it is how you keep somebody else from borrowing your certainty. So, what does the evidence in this source actually establish? It establishes that Fox aired an incorrect gasoline comparison and later corrected it. It shows examples of Fox programming devoted to lightweight cultural material during a period the source describes as economically and geopolitically serious. It shows commentators criticizing Ossoff's reference to Natalie Harp while simultaneously acknowledging his bipartisan legislative record. It shows Fox voices defending data centers and criticizing political messaging from the left. And it shows how aggressively a critic can interpret those fragments as a single narrative of distraction. What remains uncertain is just as important. This material does not prove that the White House directed Fox's editorial choices. It does not independently establish every claim about Trump's approval, Iran, intelligence warnings, personal finances, legal exposure, New York crime, data center subsidies, or record fuel prices. It does not provide enough documentation to conclude that every programming choice was designed to conceal a specific Trump failure. Those claims require records beyond what was supplied here. The central contradiction, then, is sharper than the original partisan framing. A media ecosystem can accuse others of distortion while committing its own distortions. A network can correct a false number and still deserve scrutiny for how the false number reached air. A critic can identify a real error and then weaken the case by surrounding it with claims that are not equally documented. Accountability fails when evidence becomes optional for whichever side currently has the microphone. Near the beginning, the question was whether the public is being distracted from consequential problems. The material gives us evidence of distraction like programming, but not proof of a coordinated concealment operation. It gives us one concrete correction with obvious political significance. It gives us several examples of partisan framing. And it gives us a warning about something larger than Fox or Trump. When politics becomes a competition to control attention, accuracy can become secondary to keeping the audience emotionally aligned. The next political clip will ask you to decide before you have the full record. Without a method, somebody else chooses the missing context and borrows your certainty for their advantage. Become the person who tests the decisive claim before repeating it. Don't Get Played is the practical method for doing that. The digital ebook costs only $9 as a one-time payment. Open the description and click the first link now. The same link is in the first pinned comment. A political reaction is immediate. A defensible conclusion survives the evidence.